So we're going to be discussing Bible prophecy, and here in front of us we have a Daniel 70th week chart. This was from Faithful Word Baptist Church a number of years ago, pastored by Stephen Anderson, and I believe this chart was specifically created by Richard Miller. It's a spectacular chart, best Bible prophecy chart I've ever seen. It has a lot of detail, but I think it's also clear and concise as to what exactly it's showing. I'm speaking a little bit from a biased perspective because I've looked at this chart, a number of times, and I think I have a pretty good grasp of it. But yeah, it really just shows you those particular lengths of days mentioned between Daniel and Revelation, and it shows you how they relate to one another. And this is doing it in a way I just haven't seen from anybody else. So I think it's a fantastic view of prophecy, and I'd encourage people to really look at this. Again, make your own assessment from Scripture compared to the chart, of course. But I think if you look at the Bible in detail and look at the references that this chart brings up, it's going to be very difficult to disprove this. But I do want to bring up an entirely different chart that I have seen online, and I would say it is the most challenging chart to the Stephen Anderson Faithful Word Baptist Church 70th week chart. So I'll show you right here. So this is from William Verdell, and it is also, let's just say it this way, a non-pre-trib chart, for example. Interestingly enough, this chart has a second coming and has a third coming, and it places both the second coming and third coming after the 70th week. So this chart has a gap between the 70th week and the 1,000-year reign. So in other words, there's more time after the 70th week, but before the millennial reign that occurs. It is a different approach to understanding the numbers in Daniel and Revelation, particularly what the numbers in Daniel, I'd say. So first of all, I want to point out that this chart shows the numbers for 3.5 twice, and it says that's a total of 2,520 days. That's the first error that I see in this chart, because the actual length of Daniel's 70th week is 2,550 days. And why is that? Because you have to add a leap month of 30 days every 6 years on the Hebrew calendar. So because we're dealing with a 7-year period, we therefore have to have that month added in. So yeah, that's why it's 2,550 versus 2,520. And then Daniel 12:11 says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away," and it says, "and the abomination that maketh desolate set up," that's at the midpoint, "there shall be 1,290 days." So from that midpoint, and we're not talking about the absolute midpoint of 2,550 days, we're just talking about the general midpoint of 7 years, which is at that 3.5-year mark, which is talking about 1,260 days. So basically from it would be, if I'm remembering correctly, so if you have 1,260, then the next day 1,261. So from that time all the way till the very end, 2,550th, to the 2,550th day, the last day of the week, that would be from when we're talking about. So from day 1,261 to day 2,550, versus in the first half of 1,260. So it's the relative midpoint, right? Not the absolute midpoint. And again, you have that extra 30 days because of the requirement of you add after every 6 years on a Hebrew calendar, you add 30 days. That's similar to how on a solar calendar, every 4 years, we add 1 day in February. So February 29th, versus the normal year is just ending on February 28th. But in the leap year, you add February 29th, and that takes you to 366 days in a year versus the regular 365. So it's just different approaches to get to a similar result. That's the difference. That's an important one, because again, you got to have the right amount of days in your calendar. If you don't have the right amount of days, something's going to be out of whack. And I think that's exactly what's happened here. Is you see, there's a gap of 45 days after 2,520 days, and that also comes from Daniel 12, because it mentions, as I pointed out, 1,290 days, but it also mentions in the next verse the 1,330 days, so 1,335 days. So, depending on how you subtract 1,335 from either 1,260 or 1,290, you basically get 75 or 45. So that's where those number of days are coming in. Versus my take on the 1,335 is that it is from the beginning of the 70th week, as you can see in the chart here. So 1,335 begins here and ends just past the midpoint. Okay? Versus on William Verdell's chart, he basically has from the midpoint 1,335 days, which would actually be past where this chart ends. So that is the difference. What else do I want to point out here? So a lot of what he's basing his view on, and we can, even though again he's not accurate about the length of the 70th week, we can still sort of see where he's coming from, because he would point out to like Daniel 7:25, and it says, and he, which is be speaking of the Antichrist, the beast, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So he would understand that verse to be saying that the saints of the Most High are given into the hand of the beast for that time and times and the dividing of time, which would be talking about the 3.5 years, 1,260 days. And of course, that he'd be thinking that takes place in the second half, because that'd be the time of great tribulation that Matthew 24 talks about, when the beast is actually in power. And that, what causes the great tribulation? Well, the abomination of desolation, which happens at the midpoint. So I do want to propose that the verse could mean that we're talking about the saints are given into his hand for that 42 months, 1,260 days. It could very well mean that. It could also, on the other hand, mean that where it says, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So it could also mean, when I say also, I mean like as in opposition to just the saints being given into the hands, the saints being given into the hand of the Antichrist for that amount of time. That the alternative would be that it means changing of times and laws is given into the hand of the beast for a time and times and the dividing of time. So the parallel will be, because it has a semicolon after laws, and you could see it as it's explaining that the changing of times and laws is given into his hand for a time and times and the dividing of time, 3.5 years. So you're basically connecting times with how the verse continues to say time and times and the dividing of time. So it could very well mean just simply that changing of times and laws is given into the Antichrist's hand for 42 months. It could very well just mean that. I guess on the other hand, it could mean kind of all of this, that the Antichrist will speak great words against the Most High, wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and he does all of that for 42 months. That's another way of looking at it too. Or you could, potentially look at it as he's going to wear out the saints of the Most High for 42 months. So we have to deal with that reality, because verses on the Stephen Anderson 70th week chart, we have tribulation, great tribulation, God's wrath. And the great tribulation on this chart shows for 75 days. versus the tribulation before that is 1,215 days, from what I remember. Or sorry, 1,260 days tribulation, and the Great Tribulation of 75 days, and then God's wrath of 1,215 days. So the question is, how do we deal with Daniel 7:25 in light of the fact that it seems to be saying that the saints are going to be given into the hand of the beast for a total of 42 months? Well, Matthew 24:21. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So that would be my answer. If Daniel 7:25 has to mean that the saints are given into the hand of the beast for a time and times in the dividing of time, i.e. 42 months, i.e. 1,260 days, that the Bible also teaches that the days will be shortened. And the simplest understanding of this is, if the Great Tribulation is intended to last 42 months, hence 1,260 days, well, the Bible says these days will be shortened. Now, in response, somebody could say, well, Daniel 7:25 will be fulfilled as normally understood, and that Jesus is incorporating that shortening. Like when he talks about the days being shortened, that the 42 months essentially is already talking about how the days will be shortened. My problem with that is, then really the scripture is saying these days will be shortened, and we really don't have any reference to how long it's supposed to be and what it'll be shortened to. That would be my objection, because now if the saints have to absolutely be persecuted in great tribulation for 42 months, and that's absolutely fixed and doesn't change to anything else, what were they originally given to be? Because let's face it, if something is shortened, it's different from what it was before it was shortened. So if it's shortened, again, there's a different number of days from when it was not shortened. That's what's required. So either, and think about it, just from the way it says it, they're given into, and they shall be given. When it says, and they shall be given into his hand, if that means the saints are given into his hand until a time and times in the dividing of time. Well, again, what were they had to have been given into his hand for a different number before that. So that's the dilemma at that point, because again, for something to be shortened, it's different from when it was not shortened. Okay, so that would have to mean they were given for a longer period of time, something more than 42 months, something more than 1,260 days, and they're shortened to something else. So the simplest explanation is what I'm proposing, that it is simply the 42 months has to be shortened. So they're given into the Antichrist's hand, yes, for 42 months, but God also then gives a shortening of the days. Now some might say, well, then it looks like, it's a lie or something. This verse is a lie, or it's just not reliable at that point. The scripture's saying it in vain. Well, for those who are saying that, I really think that's a problem for what, for example, Jonah had to deal with, because we have a specific time prophecy in Jonah 3:4, for example, and Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and cried and said, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. So he's stating that with no condition. It's just stated simply, yet 40 days, Nineveh shall be overthrown. And yet, we know from the story, the city of Nineveh does not get overthrown in 40 days. The people repented. And, God changed his mind in relation to that and did not destroy the city. And this is perfectly relevant to the situation because, again, we have a specific time prophecy. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. It doesn't come to pass. And yet none of us can say, well, God's a liar. If you're a Bible believer, that is. We cannot charge God with being a liar. No, in fact, what we're supposed to do is say, God, that's wonderful that you were merciful to them. We're not supposed to find fault with God. So I'm proposing the same principle in relation to Daniel 7:25, that yes, the saints appear to be given into the beast's hand for 42 months, 1260 days. And yet, the Bible also speaks of a shortening of the days. And the simplest explanation is that 1260 days is cut to a shorter time. So again, going back to just Matthew 24 a little bit here. So again, it says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. And for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." So when it's talking about no flesh being saved, it's referring to the flesh of the elect, because clearly there's the world, basically, Antichrist armies, probably most particularly, that are after the saints, that they're to persecute them, to give them tribulation. So it's not referring to them, perishing. It's referring to them wiping out the elect. Okay, that if they were able to continue the course of their action, they would completely eliminate that there'd be no more Christians left alive on the earth. And I would say also no more Jews as well. There would be no Jews, no Christians left on the earth. But that's why God shortens the days, so that there will be flesh left alive. And when is that? What is basically enabling that shortening? Well, it's because the coming of Jesus happens immediately after the tribulation of those days. Who's the one shortening it? Well, it's God. Okay, so here on the chart again, he has 2,520 days, but even if he were to put that to 2,550 on the chart, well, he still, has time beyond that anyway. He actually says there's tribulation, then great tribulation, then there's a gap of 45 days, and then he says there's great tribulation continued. Well, that's a huge problem, because now you no longer have the period of great tribulation being shortened. You have it being extended. That's just what you have. So, and again, he has a second coming that happens after the 70th week, yes, but then he's like, great tribulation continues after that. Well, the whole point is immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then also, just when it speaks of the great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And the great tribulation ends with the coming of Christ, the second coming, that is. So that would also be a contradiction, because there's not going to be a period of tribulation that's ever, and this would be, of course, in relation to persecution, right? Like basically of the world to a believer, the elect. That's what it's referring to. It's not referring to, because obviously, there's God's wrath, right? And that's going to be worse for the world compared to what the world does to the Christian, okay? That's obvious. So when it's speaking of great tribulation, it's talking about the persecution, okay, of the elect is going to be greater in this time period than ever before, and there will never be and then once this ends, it will never be greater. So you can't have a continued great tribulation, because it ends with Jesus coming, okay? Now, there's going to be tribulation, I believe, after the second coming, yes, but is not going to be as great, probably not even nearly as great as it was before that, because God's wrath is going to be happening, and the world will be have a huge problems to deal with. There'll be, fire and brimstone type of judgments to deal with, and they're just not going to have the time and resources and the will to deal with basically people that get saved after the rapture versus, and again, there's a rapture, so that's going to result in, all of the elect, well, I shouldn't say all of the elect, but I should say all of the believers at that time no longer on the earth, except for, I believe, Moses and Elijah, the two witnesses, which is a different story. But, and then, of course, I think there's going to be the 144,000 that'll have gone from heaven to the earth, for the rapture. So, in other words, 144,000 come down to stay on the earth versus the saints that are already on the earth are going to go up to heaven to be with the Lord. So, again, the concept of continued Great Tribulation is in opposition to the days being shortened, and then also how we know in Matthew 24 that tribulation ends immediately after the tribulation of those days. Speaking of the second coming, and again, Matthew 24, 29 through 31 all takes place basically in one day. Yeah, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. So that's what those 29 through 31 refers to. So there's not going to be a time after this period where there's going to be great tribulation of speaking of persecution that'll ever match or exceed what was done. So the other thing is, can we point to more? Is there even more Bible that would show us that, hey, actually, this period of wrath, which is the trumpets and the vials, actually takes place within the 70th week? Do we have any scripture for that? And the answer is absolutely yes. So the first thing I would point to is how in Revelation 8, we have, after the seven seals open, we then have the beginning of the trumpets, first trumpet, and then it goes in sequential order, second, third, fourth. Fourth angel sounds, third part of the sun is spinning, third part of the moon, third part of the stars, third part of these are darkened. And then it says in verse 13, in Revelation 8, and I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, 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 and I guess it says that 3 times, to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. Okay? So again, after the 4th trumpet judgment has occurred, or at least it's written about, right? It says, woe, 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 because there's 3 woes yet to happen, by reason of the other voices of the trumpets of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. So that means the 5th trumpet judgment, 6th trumpet judgment, 7th trumpet judgment are the 3 woes, and again, those are yet to take place from the time of the sounding of the 4th trumpet judgment. And then, when we look at Revelation 9 about the 5th trumpet judgment, that lasts for 5 months. It says, for example, in verse 5, and to them it was given, and this was basically speaking of the locust that come up out of the pit, and to them it was given that they should not kill them, speaking of people on the earth, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And it also says in verse 10, and they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Okay, and this is in verse 12, 1 woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. So the 5th trumpet judgment lasts 5 months. So that means at bare minimum that after the rapture, there's a 5-month period before the millennium of wrath of God. Okay? And then it says in verse 13, and the 6th angel sounded. Okay? And it gets into the details of that. And it tells you how long that lasts, which is Verse 15, and the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. So yeah, it's a very specific in how long it lasts. It tells you in an hour, a day, and a month, and a year. So this one lasts over a year. So that tells you, because it's a year and a month. So we were already told about the 5 months from the earlier judgment. So we have to have actually more than a year and a half from after the time of the rapture, before the millennium, okay? Before the third coming. So, in Revelation 11, it talks about the 2 witnesses and how their testimony will be for 42 months, 1260 days, and that's from the time frame of the second half, so from the midpoint on. And let's see here. Yeah, so it says in verse 7 of Revelation 11, and when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and in half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these 2 prophets tormented them that dwelt upon the earth, that dwelt on the earth. And after 3 days and a half, again, it keeps emphasizing 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. All right, so we have simply put, the witnesses finish their 42-month-long testimony. Beast kills them. 3.5 days later, they rise from the dead, and they ascend up to heaven. So at that point, unless this is why it's so critical to have a chart that's actually 2,550 days, is because without that, you're going to have a gap between the millennium, the 70th week and the millennium of additional days. And this is also kind of why I've seen some people, I think sometimes as pre-tribbers, who might want to put the 2 witnesses beginning of the first half, because they've noticed that 3.5 days that comes after that 42-month-long period. So they're like, well, in order for that to fit, because we can't have anything more than the 70th week going into the millennium, they therefore put it in the first half in order for that time frame to exist. But the reality is you actually can still believe of the context from like verse 1 to probably like verse 6 in Revelation 11 that shows you how their testimony is occurring during the time of the trotting of the Gentiles, which is, again, that's in reference to that second half period from the Great Tribulation, period, the abomination, desolation, and all that. So the strength of the post-trib pre-wrath position is actually being able to take 2 witnesses, and they're actually I want to point out, in fairness, there are pre-tribbers who recognize that there's the 2 witnesses begin their ministry in the second half, so that should be noted. But again, some pre-tribbers will want to point in the first half because they notice that there's that 3.5 day period, and they're like, well, wait a second, you can't have 3.5 days before the millennium because Jesus is supposed to come back at the very end. So yeah, we have the 2 witnesses begin their ministry from the midpoint of the 70th week, finished 42 months. They're dead for 3.5 days, and then they rise again and ascend up to heaven. So that's no problem when you have a 70 week that's 2,550 days, okay? correctly putting in that leap month. So there's no issue with the 70th week chart when you understand that. So it says in verse 13 of Revelation 11, and the same hour, where we just hear about hour from Revelation 9, right? In the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So, we can see here that at the point when the two witnesses are, after they've been resurrected, right, and there's an earthquake, the same hour they ascend up to heaven, that kills men, and it says the same hour, and then it says, because of that, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So that's directly in the immediate context, can't get around that. Second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. Well, it's not a coincidence that it says, in the same hour was there a great earthquake, because in Revelation 9, how long does the sixth trumpet, which is the second woe, because there's three woes, and the last three trumpet judgments are the three woes. So the first woe is the fifth trumpet judgment, the second woe is the sixth trumpet judgment, the third woe is the seventh trumpet judgment. And we were told in Revelation 9 that the sixth trumpet judgment is for an hour and a day and a month and a year. So again, we're literally, when it says the second woe is past, and it just said, in the same hour was there a great earthquake, we're literally fulfilling the second woe to the hour, as it said. That I mean, very specific time frame of how long that lasts. So the second woe is past. Once it says completed, right? Two witnesses ascended at the same hour. Is there a great earthquake? The part of the city fell. So that is when the sixth trumpet judgment is completed. So that is 3.5 days, and I guess in an hour, if we're looking really technically here, or something to that effect, from when the sixth trumpet judgment is fulfilled. So that totally shows you how this chart here from William Verdell is wrong, because the two witnesses are obviously within the time frame of the 70th week. 3.5 days later, the second woe is past. And all of that fits in with a chart of 2,550 days. And once you're at the sixth trumpet judgment, you only got one more left, and it said, behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So it's soon happening. After that second woe has been passed, which was completed at the same hour that the two witnesses ascend up in heaven, and there's a great earthquake. So it all definitely happens within the 70th week. So, a chart that says there's a significant amount of time between the millennium and the 70th week, that's just wrong. It's just plain old wrong. Jesus comes for the third coming on that last day of the week. Okay. Probably is the final thing I just want to mention here too is, for example, how would we know that the third coming happens on the last day of the week? Because that would be a great point to look at. So there's Daniel 9:24. It says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. And when it says 70 weeks in Daniel 9, it's referring to 490 years, not just 70 weeks of days. It's a weeks of years as opposed to weeks of days. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression. Okay, so this is telling you with the 70 weeks, with the last week is obviously the 70th week, which talks about, from verse, certainly from verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with me for 1 week, speaking of the Antichrist. Okay, so that when it mentions that 1 week in verse 27, that is the 70th week. And so and again, there's a huge gap between the 69th week and the 70th week of like 2,000 years, basically. The Messiah is cut off, and then later, when it says like in verse 26, "Fourscore and 2 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, and not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and then thereof shall be the flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." So that when it talks about the destroying of the city and the sanctuary, even though you can make application to kind of what Rome did in 70 A.D., what this is really referring to is yet future, when the city and the sanctuary are destroyed for the Antichrist. Okay, and that's when he confirms the covenant with many for 1 week. Okay, so again, going back here to 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So that is what the completion of the 70 weeks does. A lot of stuff. Now, of course, when Jesus came the first time, you can say, Jesus finished the transgression. He made an end of sins. He made reconciliation for iniquity. He brought in everlasting righteousness. But you can't quite say he sealed up the vision and prophecy because, well, in a loose sense, I guess you can say that. But in the sense of, okay, Jesus was 2,000 years ago. This prophecy includes stuff that is yet future. The prophecy isn't done yet, right? The vision hasn't been completed yet as far as its relation to being fulfilled in time, because it's yet future. And this is and to anoint the most holy. So that you can see that as relevant to example, sort of, what we sort of think of as Palm Sunday, right? Jesus riding on the donkey and being praised. That's sort of your anointing the most holy. But nevertheless, basically everything that's said here has relevance to the yet future, because, and this is sort of the nature of prophecy, it has a dual fulfillment idea, because it says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, which is Jerusalem. And again, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin. So it is going to finish the transgression of the people, make an end of sins for the people, make reconciliation for iniquity for the people, and bring in everlasting righteousness for the people. When does that actually get fulfilled as far as the people are righteous? Their sins are taken away. Well, again, Romans 11. There shall come out of Zion the deliverer, shall turn ungodliness away from Jacob. And this is God's covenant, then we shall take away their sins. It's concerning the gospel, they are enemies for our sakes, but it's touching the election, for the love of the Father's sakes. I butchered the last part there, but I think you get the point. This is also referring to how when Jesus comes for the third time, that he's going to take away the sins of Jacob, okay? That's what the 70 weeks does here. The completion of the 70 weeks has immediate effect upon the people and the holy city, Jerusalem. It finishes their transgression, makes an end of their sins, makes reconciliation for iniquity, brings in everlasting righteousness. Well, when Jesus comes, all of Israel shall be saved, right? So Jesus brings in everlasting righteousness for Daniel's people, the people of Israel. So the completion of these 70 weeks, and hence the completion of the 70th week, brings in this everlasting righteousness immediately. There's no room for a gap for what this says. And again, we've already shown that the second woe, which is the sixth trumpet judgment, happens within the time frame of the 70th week, because it happens 3.5 days after the two witnesses are killed, and they complete their testimony in the second half of the 70th week. So this chart from William Verdell is just inaccurate. It's an interesting attempt at prophecy, but it just fails at, for example, Daniel 9. It doesn't understand Daniel 9 correctly. It doesn't understand the shortening of the days in Matthew 24. Doesn't understand the 1335 days in Daniel 12. It doesn't understand Revelation 11. And I guess this is the final point or so to make here. The 1335 days in Daniel 12, the reason that we have to put that from the beginning of the 70th week instead of from the midpoint on is because if you don't do that, you end up with the resurrection and rapture occurring in after the millennium has begun, okay, which would be quite nonsensical. I think it'd be 45 days into the millennium, so that wouldn't make any sense because clearly the day that Jesus comes, he's going to resurrect and rapture his saints. Okay, that's when they get their glorified body. Versus Daniel 12, it says, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days." Daniel will stand in his lot at the end of the days because he has waited and come to the 1,305 days, the 1,335 days. And the whole point of that waiting is, again, contextually speaking, about the resurrection, because it shows earlier in Daniel 12, and at the time, Daniel 12:1, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." So obviously this is referring to the physical resurrection for the saints, for example. There's also, again, at the same time, a resurrection for the wicked. Okay, it is a quote-unquote general resurrection that's happening here, and there will also be another general resurrection after the millennium. But here, with that completion of, as it says, a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even at that same time, referring to that period of great tribulation in Matthew 24. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. So when it's talking about, it says that word awake, for in hell to be resurrected. Again, it just said, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest." Okay, you rest, then you awake, right? And stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So contextually, the rest is referring to rest before you awake, okay? Before you're resurrected. And Daniel will stand in his lot at the end of the days. He'll be resurrected because he's waited and comes to the 1,305 days. Again, the 1,305 days. And then it says, at the end of the days. Okay? What days? Well, I do know from the previous verse, for instance, it talked about from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. That's a possible answer, but the problem is that refers to the end of the week, okay? That 1,209 days fulfills the end of the week. That's when, according to Daniel 9, that everlasting righteousness is brought in, when Jesus has made reconciliation for the people, made an end of sins. That's when the third coming happens. So are we literally saying that the people aren't resurrected until 45 days after the 70th week? Well, that doesn't make any sense, because now that would be just a contradiction of, like, 1 Thessalonians 4, for example, where clearly the resurrection happens on the day of the Lord, okay? It happens on the day of the Lord, not after the day of the Lord, okay? So that's why you have to, again, I think it's very helpful this says the 1,305 days. The 1,305 days is what? Well, of the 70th week. Which takes you, from the beginning of the week just to a little bit past the midpoint. Okay? That actually, now the Bible actually can make sense. All right? So that's the key to it is, and this would be a great example of rightly dividing the word of truth. That's what we have to do. And when 2 Timothy 2, if I'm remembering rightly, 2 Timothy 2:15 speaks of that rightly dividing the word of truth, it specifically brings up about the resurrection of the dead. Now people have erred from that. So this is a perfect example of rightly dividing the word of truth with the ultimate thing we're supposed to rightly divide the word of truth over, which is the resurrection. Okay, so I've divided Daniel 12:11 from verses 12 and 13. Is I'm recognizing that, hey, verse 11 completes the end of the week, which therefore is when Jesus brings in everlasting righteousness. That's when the third coming happens. That's when all Israel shall be saved. And then from verse 12 and 13, we have to connect that back to what obviously was said in verses like 1 through 3. Again, that happens after the period of a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even at that same time. And we need to keep in mind that Jesus talked about those days being shortened. Well, if it's shortened from 1,260 days to 75 days, or 74 days, depending on how you see the day of the Lord versus kind of what immediately before that from Joel 2. But anyway, that's just the perfect example of right division, where you have to make this call, because otherwise you end up with an absurd position that says the resurrection is going to happen on like 45 days into the millennium. Well, that'd be a contradiction to 1 Thessalonians 4. So again, rightly divide the word of truth. The 1,335 days is obviously it just has to go back to when the beginning of the 70th week is. And that actually makes sense with the 1,305 days. Well, the 70th week is the reference point, right? Obviously. I mean, the 1,290 days is obviously from the 70th week. So, the 1,305 days of the 70th week. The 1,335th day, waiting and coming to that. Whether you're dead or alive. Because if you're dead, you're resting and then therefore will awake. Versus if you're alive, you're literally waiting, in the flesh, right? Versus waiting in heaven versus waiting on earth is the difference. So yeah, we have to wait till the end of, wait till the 1,305 days, okay? And that's of the 70th week, versus just generically, from the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that make desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Just generically 1,290 days versus coming to the 1,305 days. So the definitively versus 1,290 days generally. And that has a reference point from the midpoint. So, I know there's a lot of detailed information in here, but I think if you pay attention to this and review the scriptures, Revelation 11 is just, probably the most key on this, honestly, recognizing how that definitively shows how the vial judgment, trumpet judgments take place within the 70th week. When you understand that the week is actually 2,550 days, not 2,520. So that's just how it is, and this chart from Faithful Word Baptist is the one to defend, because it actually deals with all these texts. And again, people can bring up various objections that they may have, such as from William Verdell's chart. But and out of fairness, there's no position in prophecy that isn't going to have some little chink in the armor, because there's always going to be some other verse that somebody can pull out that is going to be a bit of a challenge to your position. And this is what people often do is they don't typically like to address objections to their position. Now, sometimes especially if you can, people will answer them, especially if there's easy answers. But we need to not only be willing to do that, we need to be willing to encounter the more difficult objections that are out there as well. But just be open and honest about it. If we have a weak spot, we have a weak spot. But I think by far any prophecy dealings out there, any prophecy charts, this is the best one, and it answers, I think, the most questions as well. I don't see anybody else that's really properly answering the shortening of the days. On the pre-trib side, it just you look at different teachings that are out there. It's almost like every different preacher has a significant difference in how they understand the timeline of prophecy anyway. So for premillennial, which is obviously the Bible truth, this is the chart to go with. This will give you a solid understanding of prophecy. And I find it to answer the most objections, have the least amount of problems, and I think it answers objections really, really well. It's just factoring in things that just other people aren't considering. So hope this was a help to anybody who's listened to this, and a lot to take in, but it's a lot that's worth studying and putting your time and effort into.